I am very excited to get to share with you about the Breeding Bird Atlas. I've got some slides, so I will go ahead and share those with you. There we go. So, all right, there we go. The Maryland and DC Breeding Bird Atlas is a community science project that was started back in 2020, this version of it. This is the third bird atlas that has been conducted in Maryland and DC. Maryland and DC have always done them together. And it's basically a mapping project. So if you think about an atlas, right, you've got like a world atlas or a road atlas. In this case, it's a breeding bird atlas. So we're just mapping the distribution of all of the birds that breed within Maryland and DC and trying to collect a few other bits of information about them, like their abundance in the region and when they're breeding, when they get here. So we're not so much focused on the birds that spend the winter here as much as just the ones that are nesting here. But even that's over 200 species of birds. There's been about 220 recorded breeding or thought to be breeding in Maryland and DC, which is a lot when you think about how small really Maryland and DC are. So like I said, this is the third time that this project has been done. I've got the dates of the previous projects listed here in the 80s, the 2000s, and then this one, which was started in 2020 and will go until 2024. And each of them are 5 years long, and they're separated by about 20 years. And so what that means is that you're able to track changes in distribution of birds across time. Every project is like, you know, a snapshot of each species distribution in Maryland and DC. And as you can imagine, that changes as habitat and land use changes and as climate changes. There's all kinds of factors that influence where birds are breeding. And this is one of the best ways of tracking that. There are very few projects that are able to get the fine scale level of detail that we do. And it's basically because we have a small army of volunteers that go out and put tens of thousands of hours into searching for breeding birds. In the top right of this slide, you see there's a grid that looks like Maryland. This grid is it's a collection of 3 by 3 mile blocks, and observers go into every single one of them. There's about 1,300 of them. They go into every single one and they try and find as many species of birds breeding there as they can. And so you can imagine that takes hundreds of people, and it takes them thousands and thousands of hours. So this really is one of the most substantial sort of community science efforts. They take about 5 years to complete, and then, you know, we give folks a break for 20 years or so before starting in on the next one. So these data are used to document population changes of birds, but also to identify where the important areas are for breeding birds, and which species might be at risk in the region. It can find important areas for just one species, or maybe important areas for a group of species. So to collect all of the data, in the past, paper forms were used for this. But, you know, it's the 21st century, so now we have handheld computers that we can use. So essentially all of our data are collected using a platform called eBird. If you've hung out with birders before, you might have heard of this. It's very popular with birders because it allows you to track all of the species that you see while you're on an outing, and it records the location where you saw them and the date and time that you saw them at, which is quite a lot of information for you just writing down the species that you found. And all of that information fits perfectly into what we're looking for. We want the date of the observation as well as where the observation came from. So it works perfectly. If you haven't used the eBird app before, there is also a web page that you can do, and you wanted to participate in the atlas, the only thing that you really have to know about participating in this project is something called a portal. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but it's basically a label that says, hey, this checklist, I wasn't just birding. I wasn't just looking at birds. I was trying to find things for the Maryland and DC Breeding Bird Atlas. And that's how I know that, okay, this person was part of my project. And that's just in the settings section. But I'll get into that a little bit later. One of the other things that you can do with eBird is you can record the behavior of the birds that you observe. And this is really important when you're looking specifically for breeding birds. You can also upload photos or recordings of what you see, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who created eBird, also has an amazing product called Merlin, MERLIN. And Merlin is actually able to fairly accurately identify photos or recordings that you upload to it. So if you haven't heard of that, I'd recommend looking into it. It's actually pretty accurate. And then the other thing that you can do with eBird is you can explore the data. You can see a real-time map of sightings. In past atlases, this wasn't possible. You know, you sent in your paper forms and you waited till the book was printed at the end. But now we're able to see it as the data come in, which is fascinating. So we're looking for breeding birds specifically. Now, how do you find breeding birds as opposed to just birds that are hanging out? Their behavior is really indicative of this. Of course, you can find their nest. If you find their nest, well, gosh, you know that they were breeding. Can't argue with that. But nests are hard to find, you know, in a lot of cases. Birds are pretty good at hiding them. So we can use the behavior of the adults to decide whether or not they're breeding there. And so the project has a series of breeding codes that we classify the different behaviors that you might see. And so there's about 22 different breeding codes, I think, but they basically fall into 4 different categories. You're either seeing courtship between birds. You're seeing birds that are upset that you're there because they've got a nest nearby or babies. You found the nest or you found the chicks. And so then every time that you have a piece of breeding evidence like this, you record the location and the date to go along with it. And this builds up a map of sightings across the whole region that are also linked with the time. So we can see when birds are breeding in across the season as well. So some of the courtship behaviors that you might run into, I mean, just birds that are singing. Singing is pretty much just done to try and attract a mate or to defend a territory. This is a chestnut-sided warbler here singing. These guys breed in Maryland, mostly in the western side of the region. You'll also find pairs of birds. You know, you think of a cardinal, you see a male and a female together, there's a pair. Duets are something that birds will do as well to maintain their pair bonds. So singing isn't just used to attract a mate or to hold a territory, it's also used to maintain that relationship between two birds. And so Carolina wrens are a good example of this. They'll do that. They'll sing back and forth to each other, or barred owls will do that. And then you've got full-on courtship displays. You know, mourning doves. They'll do this slow glide around a female, trying to show her what a great flyer they are. Or you know, you might see titmice. You might see them feeding each other. That kind of thing. All of these are evidence that, hey, these birds are about to breed there. And once you move a little bit further along in the season, you run into birds that are more upset. And these are birds that are territorial. They've seen somebody that has come into their territory and they don't like it, and they're going to chase them away. Or they found a bird or a predator that they think is a threat to them or to their nests or chicks. If it's a threat to them, most species just kind of leave the area. But if you've got a nest or chicks to defend, then you know, you might see a bird that is chirping a lot, looks angry, is hopping around from branch to branch, maybe even dive bombing the predator. And then, of course, I'm sure you've heard of the broken wing displays that killdeer and other shorebirds will do. There's actually quite a number of birds that will do displays like this, where they appear injured and try and attract the predator away from their chicks. So that only happens when there's chicks around, and so that's almost as good evidence of breeding as actually finding the nest. This is a common nighthawk on a rock, very upset. This nighthawk had chicks nearby. This isn't a Maryland photo. This was out west in Saskatchewan. If you find a nest, I mean, you pretty much know that bird is breeding. It's really hard to argue with that. But the construction process is actually the easiest time to find the nest, because you have the parents going back and forth to the nest, and when they're flying there, they're carrying materials to build it with. So all you have to do is see a bird that's flying with grass or sticks in its mouth, and you know it's going to build a nest. So there you go. You've just confirmed breeding right there at that location. Of course, if you find a bird that's incubating on a nest, like this female blue grosbeak, you know, you've got eggs in the nest, maybe you've got chicks there. That's all fantastic evidence, really the best that there is. But you can also use old nests if you're able to identify those. Some nests are almost impossible to identify, but others are quite distinctive. You know, if you think of maybe a barn swallow, they build these mud nests on the side of buildings, often under an overhang or something. Nothing else builds a nest like them. And of course, if you find young birds, the trick with young birds is just that they have to be quite young. They can't have traveled too far from their nest site. So being in the nest as a young bird is actually pretty dangerous, right? Because you're restricted to this one site for, you know, depending on the species, might be a week and a half, couple weeks, maybe even longer than that. And that's a long time for predators to find you. So most birds try to get out of the nest kind of as quickly as they can, but that means that they're still going to be dependent on their parents for a while after that. Often, you know, a couple of weeks or more. And so these birds, they usually have really short tails. Their bills haven't fully developed. They still have kind of a fleshy gape on the sides. And, you know, if they're ducks or geese, I mean, those ones are very easy to tell that they're babies and still dependent on their parents. So that's excellent evidence. The other thing, though, is that birds, almost across the board, they eat food when they find it. No sense taking the risk of losing your food, right? If you can just eat it right on the spot. So when you see a bird that's carrying food, this doesn't apply so much to a lot of the birds that you see at feeders. A lot of those birds will take food off and hide it. But Most other species, especially with insects, if they're carrying food, they're taking it to their chicks. So if you see that, that's very good evidence that the bird is breeding there. And the other thing is if they're carrying poop. So almost all songbirds, when they're nestlings, they poop in a kind of it's a bag almost. All of their poop is contained in this gelatinous bag, and the parents will carry that away so that the nest isn't contaminated. This is a starling that's flying out of its nest hole, and it's carrying one of these fecal sacs, they're called. And if you see that, I mean, you know that that bird just came from a nest that's quite close by. So that's kind of an overview of how we collect the data, what sort of things we're looking for. It's really exciting stuff, honestly. I love atlasing. The stuff that you learn when you get out there, the stuff that you get to see, it's different. Pretty much everyone who has done birding before and then tries atlasing says, hey, you know, this is very similar to birding, but it's not the same. It's a lot slower. You know, you don't have to know as many species to go atlasing because what you're really focused on is the behavior. Is that individual bird breeding or not? And so you end up spending time watching these birds and you learn so much about them. It's fantastic. I really love it. So I've got two maps on the screen here. These are maps of where people have gone out and done atlasing and how much of it they've done in a particular area. So each one of these squares, these are those 3 by 3 mile blocks. That's kind of how we measure everything for the atlas, whether it's in the block or not. And the brighter the blue, the more hours that people spent there looking for birds. You can see this graph tops out at 100. Many of these blocks have hundreds of hours beyond that. It's really quite astounding. In the last atlas, which was in the early 2000s, they recorded about 60,000 hours of effort across the whole region. We've just completed 2 years of field work for this project, and we are at just over 70,000 hours of effort. Now, they're not entirely comparable because we're using an app that tracks how long you're out there finding birds for. Back in the early 2000s, they were just recording it on a piece of paper. So it's not quite as precise, but still the amount of effort that has gone into this project so far is astounding. This is a map. It's not really a map. This is just a picture of the latitude and longitude of every single checklist location that has been submitted to the Atlas project so far in the last 2 years. There's about 20,000 locations. So this means that volunteers have gone out to every one of these green dots and they've looked for birds there. I think this is one of my favorite things that I have seen because it shows just how much people have gone out literally into every corner of the region. It's amazing. And this is what it kind of looks like when you drill down to that block level. So you see that there's this black outline around the side. This is a block. This block is called Solomon's Island Southeast, and it's down in St. Mary's County. And you can see that atlasers have gone to every one of these dots. The bigger the dot, the more checklists that they submitted at that location. And the more yellow it is, the more species that they found at that location. You can see that people were really getting around in this block, and they were finding all kinds of stuff pretty much everywhere. I really enjoy looking at things like this. I think it's quite interesting. Here's pulling back to the region level again. This is a map of species richness from the last atlas. So this is how many species were found in each block. The brighter the yellow, the more species that were found breeding there. And this is really interesting to kind of take a look at, because you can see that out here in Garrett County, where the elevation is a bit higher, you've actually got quite a lot of species out there. Now the population of people is lower out there too, which makes a difference when you're trying to have volunteers help out. It's a lot easier if it's very close to them. So this is, people had to travel pretty far to get out here. You can also see that out here on the eastern shore, it's a kind of more bluish, not quite as yellow. This is a quite agricultural area, so maybe that's not too surprising. Looking in Howard County here, right in central Maryland, gosh, that's very yellow. Howard County probably isn't really an island of magnificent biodiversity like this shows, but this is probably representative of just a lot of people working really hard to try and find as many species as they can in their county. The other thing is that I'll focus a lot on the last atlas in terms of showing the results, because we're only 2 years into this project, and while we've collected data from pretty much everywhere in the region, and we have a comparable amount of total effort, that effort hasn't been spread out evenly enough yet across the region to really be able to compare the projects. So rather than show you incomplete results, I think it's more informative to show results from the last project. So here's a neat look at Maryland and DC. This is the elevation of the region, and you can see that Garrett County is indeed very high in relation to the rest of the state, and kind of drops off. We've got another little mountain ridge here at the boundary of Washington and Frederick counties, and then this, I think, is one of the most interesting things. This is called the fall line, and it's basically where the rock of the Piedmont, which is this area up in here, meets the coastal plain, which is a lot softer. And so there's a number of cities that are built along this fall line, including DC, Baltimore. I think it goes up to Wilmington in Delaware. And this was kind of the head of navigation for ships that were coming in, because of the rapid elevation change. The water wasn't really, you couldn't take your ship up past the fall line. And so this had an important impact on development in the area, but it also really affects bird distributions. If you look at this is a map of some of the broad ecoregions.
Hawk out there somewhere
that we have. And you can see that, gosh, it really follows that fall line. This teal here, this is the Piedmont. And then this pink and green, these are the coastal plain ecoregions. And so the plants really follow a lot of these elevation changes, and the birds respond to the plants. So you'll see that that a lot of the, this area right in here, this is that boundary of Washington and Frederick County, where you've got a bit of a mountain ridge, right up in here. This is kind of the end of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And this is an important breeding habitat for a lot of species with that added elevation. So if we look at some of those distributions, then this is a map of osprey from the last atlas. So remember, these are maps from 20 years ago, early 2000s. And you can see that all of these green blocks, these are where atlasers found osprey breeding. And you can see that they don't go too much past that fall line, right? They're pretty much just around the bay and up the rivers. A lot of these blocks follow the rivers up. And that makes a lot of sense because osprey, they just eat fish. Here's a map of a bird called a seaside sparrow. It's here in this picture. This is a pretty typical view of it and its habitat. You pretty much only find them way down in very low elevation areas where the water is still salty enough to have these salt marshes. Looking at another coastal plain species, this is the brownheaded nuthatch. You might have white-breasted nuthatches coming to your feeders. These guys are similar, but they're pretty much restricted to pines on the coastal plain. And so you see that there's a few of them down at the very tip of the western shore, and then they follow the shoreline of the eastern shore, pretty much all the way down and around the bay. Here's a map of a drab little bird called a warbling virio. It's named warbling because it just has the most lovely song. You can see that they're pretty much just found in that Piedmont area. So before the elevation gets too high, but they don't go past that fall line much at all. Here's one that only likes those higher elevations, the rose-breasted grosbeak. You can see they've got a giant bill. That's what they're named for, grosbeak. I used to do some bird banding, and whenever we caught one of these guys, and you had to go and pick it up out of the net, you just kind of said goodbye to your fingers because they have got a very strong bite to them. But they're almost only found at the highest elevations that we have in Maryland. You can see that they're right here along that strip of mountains up between between Washington and Frederick counties, which I think is so fascinating. Maryland has two different kinds of chickadees that nest here. One is the black-capped chickadee. Black-caps you find mostly north of here and in Canada. And you can see that, well, the higher elevation, it does tend to be colder up there in the winters. And chickadees are pretty much just found right up until the Allegheny, Washington County borders. And if you look at Carolina chickadee, that's the other chickadee that we have nesting here, and they're found pretty much everywhere south of us. They only go up to that county boundary. This is one of my favorite pairs of maps of breeding birds because it just shows how two extremely similar birds, right? Carolina and black-capped chickadees, how they can have such distinctive niches in the environment that their breeding ranges stop almost at a county line. It's amazing. So one of the other interesting things that I had mentioned earlier that an atlas can do is track changes in bird populations. And a lot of the time when you're thinking about tracking changes, you're thinking about tracking declines in populations, but that's not always the case. This is a happy one, the tree swallow. Tree swallows nest in cavities, in holes in trees. And this was the map from the very first atlas. So this was in the 80s. And you can see that, well, they're not super rare across the region, but they're not exactly common either. Fast forward 20 years to the second atlas, and they're everywhere. You can hardly go anywhere without finding a tree swallow. And this was pretty much the result of people putting up bird boxes for eastern bluebirds. Bluebird boxes work fantastic for tree swallows, and they just took off across the region. Really nice to see that sort of change in population happening. Here's another one. This is a horned lark. So horned larks are kind of funny compared to a lot of other birds because they like nesting on the ground, and they like it if the soil is bare or if there is very, very short vegetation. So basically, areas that you won't find any other birds in, there might be horned larks nesting there. This is a map from the first atlas, and you can see that out in kind of the more open agricultural areas where you might have some of these open fields, you've got quite a number of horned larks, and these horned larks are also one of the earliest nesting of all songbirds. They're actually singing and pairing up right now. They might even be nest building very soon, and so they can get a clutch of eggs out before a lot of these fields are actually planted. But if you look out here in Garrett County and Allegheny County, you've got quite a number of horned larks as well. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there were a lot of strip mines up in this area that were being reclaimed. And so that process resulted in bare ground and short grass, good breeding habitat for horned larks. Now you look at their distribution 20 years later, especially focused here in Western Maryland, and they're not there so much. And this seems to be the result of that vegetation growing up and that habitat just kind of becoming unsuitable for them. Instead, you find them much more out here in the Piedmont area, and even more widespread on the Eastern Shore. So we've also documented in this project a number of new breeding species, birds that have never been recorded nesting in Maryland or DC before. All of these, I guess, all of these species were new to Maryland. DC hasn't had any new ones yet, but this white one up here on the top left, that's called a white ibis. There was a pair found with a nest with chicks in it down on an island in Somerset County. Trumpeter swans, mute swans used to be fairly common in Maryland, but trumpeter swans have never nested here before, and they were found in Baltimore County on Hart Miller Island. This is a Eurasian collared dove. They're an introduced species that they began their introduction down in Florida and really spread, I think that was in the 50s-ish anyways, and really spread quickly across the entire continent. And it has been kind of a surprise to a lot of people that they've never nested in Maryland before. They've nested multiple times basically within sight of the state border, but never in the state. So people were kind of excited about this one. This was in Washington County. Now, new to this Atlas project are a handful of species that have just started breeding within the last few years here, but weren't recorded on any of the previous Atlas efforts. So this is a Mississippi kite. They're an incredibly acrobatic hawk that is found mostly breeding south of us. And they had been nesting for a couple of years in Calvert County, and then there was another one that nested in the parking lot of an elementary school in Montgomery County this past year. This Merlin down here in the bottom left, it's a tiny little falcon with a big personality. And they were found nesting out in Western Maryland. And then sandhill crane, also nesting in Garrett County. They're a very tall bird, I think about 4 feet high. And there's been a pair that have been nesting successfully there for a few years. Quite exciting. This is one of the other things that we can do with some of the data that are collected now, largely because of how the data collection process has changed. Because people can report observations so easily through the app, we get more observations, and we get observations from across the whole breeding season. So this is a figure of northern cardinals and when they breed in Maryland and DC. So on the bottom here, you'll see that this starts in January and it goes to the end of the year. And you've got 6 different categories of breeding behavior. And these blue dashed lines, these are kind of when the main breeding season tends to be. That's what we consider to be our safe dates. That's when you can safely assume that a bird is nesting in an area if you see it and it's not migrating or something. And then these distributions here, this shows where the data were clustered. So the higher the peak on this, the more observations that there were. The more that it's pulled apart, the more that the data were spread out. It's the density of the observations. And then this little box here, this shows where 50% of the data were, and this line shows where the middle of the data were. So it just kind of shows you a rough picture of when people were reporting observations. And you can see that singing, upset birds, courting birds, they all kind of happen more or less at the same time, and they're all pretty protracted throughout the season. They're all pretty spread out. Where it gets interesting is down here with the nest building, the incubation period, and then the young birds. And you can see that there's this stair step happening with all of this. And that is, of course, what you would expect, but it's fascinating to see this. These sort of data haven't been collected before at a local scale like this. So it's really exciting. You can see that nest building is done kind of all clumped together in late spring. And then pretty much the whole population is kind of following the same timeline. And you get a lot of incubation happening next. And then the young all fledge in about July. And sightings taper off towards early fall. I'm really excited about this, and I can't wait to explore these sort of data more with other species, especially ones that are less well known. So if you wanted to get involved with this project, the main thing is just watching for breeding behavior on birds. You know, this is a Carolina wren with a mouth full of sticks. It's heading off to build a nest. That's breeding behavior. And then you can submit these checklists to eBird. The easiest way to do that is with the app. And the only thing you have to make sure that you do is use that atlas portal, which is basically the label that says this was for the atlas. And that's under settings. There's lots more information about stuff online on the website, ebird.org. If you just Google eBird, Atlas, Maryland, anything like that, it'll come up. And this is my email address down here. You can always email me questions. So I just thought I'd run through kind of, if you are using the app, how you might submit a checklist. This is what the app looks like when you open it up. So you'd have to download it first and set up an account, and then you'd go into these 3 dots down here. That's the settings. That's where you'd change your portal. And once you've got that done, you can hit the big green button called Start Checklist. You get a list of species. It starts tracking how long you've been atlasing for and how far you've walked. And you can pick the species that you find. So we'll pick mallard. We saw 2 mallards, so we can write in, you saw 2 of them. And then you'd go to add breeding code, and you just tap on this box here, and then you get a list of all of the breeding codes. And basically you just read through some of the descriptions and look for the one that looks the best to you. If you saw chicks with a mallard, then you'd pick recently fledged young. And then once you're done with that, you can just tap done, and you can, it'll ask you whether you're submitting a complete checklist of the birds that you were able to identify. This just means are all the species that you saw when you started this checklist, are all those species on your list? And that just makes a difference for us when we're calculating statistics on the data. We want to know, you know, we want to know whether if you didn't find a species, if there's something that's not on the checklist, is that because you just didn't write it down? Or is it because that bird wasn't there? Or, and this is the tricky one for statistics, was it there, but you just didn't find it? And so by having you answer that question, did you write all the birds that you found down? That helps us a lot with being able to figure that out. And then you just have to hit continue and submit it, and you're done. So that's all that I've got. This is my email address down here, and this is the eBird website. But if you just Google for it, you should be able to find it. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. Let's do some questions and answers now. Let me put a spotlight on you just so that everybody can see. Yes, love the spotlight section. This is great, and it was important. We wanted to have you come and talk because this is a perfect time for folks to get involved with the project. We're getting into spring, so there's a lot of mating and breeding going on. Hopefully, will be coming up. So we're right in the right part of the year for this. So we have one, and there are no silly questions. The question is, where do birds sleep when they're not raising chicks? When the nests are empty, where do the adult birds sleep?
That's a really good question. I was out just a couple of weeks ago talking with my partner about that question. Like, you know, all the birds that you see during the day, they're still here, but you can't find them. Where are they? A lot of cavity nesting birds, so birds like chickadees, titmice, starlings, things like that. Birds that nest in holes in trees, woodpeckers. A lot of those species will also roost in holes. So they'll find, in fact, chickadees are a great example of this. You'll get big clusters of them in the wintertime, and they do that to keep each other warm as well. But a lot of other species just find a protected spot in a tree or a bush, and a lot of times it's just right up against the trunk, kind of in a sheltered area. Waterfowl will be out in the water for as far as they can get away from land, that sort of thing. So it varies a little bit from species to species, but basically they want protection from predators and a place to stay warm.
Gabriel, there's a couple of questions on how to make sure that you're on the right checklist for the atlas. Could you go over that again? And if you...
Yeah, yep, I can. In fact, what I can do here is I can try and find the some information to link to. But if you're on the app, then down in the bottom right, if you're on an iPhone, then there'll be 3 dots, and I think I can show you here. Okay, so you've got these 3 dots down here in the bottom. You'll tap those, and then at the bottom of that list, it says settings and account. So you'll tap that, and then down here at the bottom of that, it says portal. Now I didn't spend too much time on this. Then you can go down and select the portal. I didn't spend too much time on this because they're actually going to be changing it very soon and making it so much easier to find the portal. It'll basically be a button right on the home page, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But that's how it's done for now. It's kind of annoying. But once you set it there, then you're done. You can leave it. You'll be on the portal.
Jenny asks, do you need your phone to track your location?
You don't need it to. If you want to see tracks of where you've been, I like that, but you don't have to.
So if you just want to use the computer and go home and put your information in afterwards, that's the other alternative.
And you can definitely do that as well. I did put the link to the website in. It's ebird.org/AliceMDDC. So if you do that, then you can just go to submit a checklist on there. And you know, you can take your paper checklist or whatever, and it just asks you for the same information. What time did you start at? How long were you doing it for? Where were you? And then what did you see?
So she asked, they asked, would you identify your location manually? Is there a map, or is there a lat long or something that you have to input?
Yeah, if you're using it with the location on, then it will suggest a location for you. But I assume that question is because you've got it turned off. So if you want to do it manually, then it'll, I think, then you'll be given a map when you go to submit the checklist, and you can just zoom in and tap on the location where you were. So if you're in Rockville, you know, you would just zoom in and then you find, oh, Redgate Park, that's where I was this morning, and you tap on Redgate Park.
Christine wants you to talk about the bird whose population exploded after I guess the bluebird boxes were introduced, and did this increase happen to decrease another bird population?
No, it didn't. Aerial insectivores in general, so these are birds that are not necessarily taxonomically related to each other, but they all share the same foraging habit. They all eat insects while they're flying. So this includes things like swallows, swifts, nighthawks, flycatchers. All these birds are showing declines just across the whole continent and in Europe as well. Some of them very steep. In Canada, chimney swifts have declined like 98%. Most of them aren't quite that bad, but generally aerial insectivores are not doing very well. So tree swallows are actually one of the species that have been doing more okay than a lot of the other ones. They're still fairly common, and that wasn't really an impact to anything else. The only thing that it sometimes does affect is bluebirds, because tree swallows are more aggressive than the bluebirds are. But there's ways to mitigate that just in how you place your boxes, where the tree swallows won't bother the bluebirds.
Yeah, and Christina, is it because the insects are in decline?
Yeah, that's kind of the general thinking. It's funny, you'd think it would be really like straightforward to figure out, okay, all these birds, they eat the same thing. It's got to be the insects, right? Problem
No,
is
it's the pesticides. May I make a comment?
What is it that's driving that? So it seems to be a combination of things. Seems to be climate change. So
may I make a comment? Just one.
There's a mismatch that's happening between birds that are coming up here and they're arriving a little earlier, that they're arriving a little later than the insects that are hatching. There's issues with land use changes, right? So you don't have the habitat for the species anymore. And then there's issues with insect declines, and this is linked pretty strongly back to pesticides.
And Susan, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, I'm sorry, I wasn't sure about my mic. One thing that occurred to me most definitely is pesticides and the desire to eliminate flies, gnats, and other flying insects that are the main meal of the day for the tree swallows, for bats, and that there is a cultural resistance, a fear of bats, a resistance to anything that is a fly, a gnat, a mosquito, any biting insect that is a wonderful meal. And we do not need pesticides as much as we need the birds to naturally come in and, okay, get the tree swallows arrived first. I lived in Vermont. I'm back in Maryland, my home state, past 6 years, and finally have the time and the attention to go back to birding seriously. And my property, a former one-room schoolhouse, the tree swallows would arrive the first, then the barn swallows, and would be able to see on the Connecticut River the bank swallows. If they were gone, and I guess they're being eliminated more and more by habitat destruction through real estate development, among other things, and coastal, well, Boston was a marsh and they fill it in and there's the Back Bay. And that was a long time ago. Historically, I always come back to, having worked for preservation land trusts, what did we do to the land? And what does that do to the environment? And if the bugs are biting us, we can only blame ourselves. And that's the main point I wanted to make. That is not a matter of well, it's a matter of lack of food, Gabriel, but we did it. We kill the food. We hunt and kill the insects, and we don't even eat them. Like a deer hunter sometimes enjoys the venison, but that's more and more rare. Got used to what a deer hunter is, and he's your next door neighbor in Vermont who's helping you repair something in your house. I'll close then, because I'm excited to be a part of this. And one little question I have about the Mississippi kite, because I can't find the book that, but this book was written by the same gentleman. Oh, that's backwards. Isn't that cute? Was written by Ted Levin, if you're aware of him, a major writer naturalist who lived in my neck of the woods. I'm quoting a song I really like. I think, is there a Florida kite? Is that
there isn't a Florida kite that is currently named that, but
oh, wait.
birds have their
Maybe
names changed all the
it's
time.
the Everglades or the there's a Florida breeding bird. Well, they're very rare, and maybe he saw the last of them 10 years ago.
Was it
Or
snail
20?
kite?
My goodness, I'm really dating myself here. But that's obvious from my hair. Wait, let me find this. So if we look at our Petersons, woo, that's Western birds. If you look at the Petersons, because it's East Coast, do we have any kind of a kite? Maybe it was going extinct at the time, and maybe he studied it along with my prior boss, heading down to Florida. Oh, for vacation? No, we're looking for the bird and seeing if they're still breeding. So is there a Florida / Everglades, Gulf Coast kite?
There is, yeah. There's the
and what is it
snail
called?
kite.
There you go, snail
Snail
kite.
yeah. Yeah, there's they've been particularly struggling since this introduction of a new snail. They only eat snails. They've got these bills that are perfectly designed for, or perfectly adapted for getting into the snail shells and extracting everything. And this invasive species has come in of snail, and they haven't been able to feed on those as well. Although I went to a talk a few years ago that showed that there may be some, rapid adaptation happening, where they're able to take advantage of this new population with the change in their bill size, which is really cool.
Wow, that is cool. Christine also wants to know, when we have locusts or the cicadas, like last year with brood X, were those good birding times or?
Yeah, the cicadas were fantastic. So obviously this is a huge, influx of biomass onto the system, and the birds took advantage of it. And so up until this past year, there'd only been about 15 or so different species recorded eating the brood 10 cicadas. So we started a small little side project asking people while they were atlasing or just looking at birds to also tell us, hey, were any birds eating cicadas? We got like upwards of 50 different species of birds documented eating cicadas. Now, this isn't surprising. This is what everybody kind of already thought was happening, but it hadn't actually been documented before. So that was pretty cool.
All right. Any other questions for Gabriel while we have him here? I hope that y'all are really excited about this new aspect of birding called atlasing, and we can go out and look for different bird behaviors, not just crossing them off of a life list. And the data is very important, as we saw with all of those different maps and the way that they're synthesizing and analyzing the data to really help give us some ideas and to guide, hopefully guide some decision making moving forward, so that we can be doing things that benefit our bird neighbors and our bird friends. And I ask you, the Chimney Swifts, we have a location across from the Natural History Society of Maryland, and it is a chimney where it was we counted, God, now I can't think, 5,000, I think, that went in September. And so we had a whole swift watching night kind of thing out there. I know that they get into their little pairs, and each pair goes and finds some in the spring, and then they all come back as they go back down to South America. But is there the fact that they were there, is that any indication of breeding, or do you have to see them in their individual chimneys for it to count?
Yeah, chimney swifts are kind of an interesting one from an atlasing perspective, because they travel around so much during the day, and their nest sites are pretty inaccessible. You know, and people don't really like when you're staring with binoculars into their house, you know, trying to see if a chimney swift is going into their chimney. So you're right. There's chimney swifts don't nest in those communal roost sites. That's just for migration, and then fledglings after they've left the nest, they'll all group up and use those. But yeah, during the actual breeding season, you're pretty much just looking for pairs that are using their own individual chimneys. And the best way to confirm that they're breeding at a location is to see them zip down into a chimney. But like I said, that has some issues associated with it.
Right. Don't go climbing on people's roofs and looking into their chimneys. Okay. We did not tell you to do that.
We gotta get Santa Claus to become an atlaser.
There you go.
You can look for all those old nests.
There we go. Well, that's, I guess, good. If you're getting your chimney cleaned out and they find a nest in there, would that count? Or?
Yep.
All right. Any other questions right now for Gabriel? Again, thank you all for. Go ahead and put it in the chat box or raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you so you can unmute. Well, Gabriel, I hope that we have added some more eyes to the Atlas project, some more data points here, and I hope everybody gets involved, goes out, download the eBird, and if you have a problem, I'm sure that Gabriel doesn't mind you contacting him by email to ask any questions as you transition into becoming a atlaser, because your data is important. You can be a part of science. This is real data, and it's really important. So contribute and have fun. It's a fun way to contribute to our scientific knowledge and moving that scientific frontier forward. So thank you all. Let us know if you get involved with that and check back. We'd love to hear from you, your experiences. And Gabriel, please stay in touch and come visit us at our museum. We'd love to show you our collections. Ours are not living anymore, but they have a second life. They have a second life of teaching other people. So Everybody stay well, stay curious, and get out there and enjoy the spring weather and look for bird behavior and breeding. Thank you all.
See you later.
Bye, everybody.